Building Men is brought to you by Finish the Race Apparel, FTRapparel.com, the creators of all things Building Men, and by Become Stronger Industries, become-stronger.com, the creators of handmade steel maces, hammers, and other badass equipment.
I love sort of that. Like if you think of like a loving drill sergeant, that's kind of like my persona in a fun and very loving and supportive way. But like none of that existed when I was in middle school and high school. So when all these kids, this locker room thing where it's like, if we love you, we're going to pick on you a little bit, or if there is this thing where we the playful ribbing, I would just like freak out and either want to fight or cry because I didn't understand that relationship until I got to my military service.
You're listening to the Building Men podcast with Dennis and Anthony Miralda, brothers on a mission
to help you become the strongest version of yourself, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically.
Welcome back to the Building Men podcast. I am your host, Dennis Miralda. Today, I am joined by a gentleman named Jason Skeesick. He is the creator of Spear and Clover, a podcast. He's a visionary entrepreneur who he wants to see the world as it should be, and he cannot wait to take action. That is how he starts off his own podcast. Jason, welcome to the show, my man. Good to see you.
Dennis, it's good to see you too, man. I'm excited about this.
And I appreciate you having me on your podcast. We were able to chop it up about a week ago. And so depending on the time that both of these podcasts air, it was cool to get to know you through the questions that you had asked me on the podcast. And I always find it interesting, the work that people do to prepare for a podcast. And also wanted to congratulate you. You're right now, I guess it's episode 15 that's out. You just had on Diablo, the former WWE.
Yeah.
I was just listening to that on my drive in here today. But there's a thing, 90% of podcasts will basically, by the time they get to episode 12, they're done. So it's only a small percentage of podcasts even make it to episode 13. So first wanted to congratulate you for making over that first big hump. Congratulations.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate it. I was really nervous. I've done a lot of coaching calls. I was fortunate enough that when 2020 happened, I had already been using Zoom professionally for a few years. So I was a little bit ahead of the world on that, which is great. But I've never done anything that I would call like art. I've never put anything out. I've put out some, tactical and strategic help for coaches and things like that for people in my industry, but I've never done anything like art. And so it's a totally new world. I'm learning totally new muscles to flex. And I was a little nervous that I wasn't going to be able to get to 12. I wanted to have 12 recorded by the time I started recording. And I think I had 30 when we dropped our first episodes. Right. And I think I'm over 40 now. So I've really enjoyed it. And at this point, I would do it every day if I had the access to more guests.
And it's your excellent interview skills. I felt very comfortable and at home during the podcast where you had me on as your guest. And you're doing everything the systematic, correct way. Very different than the way that I did my podcast as I started. Like I mentioned on yours, mine was ready, fire, aim. I went through. I went ahead and made every mistake you could possibly made. It sounded really challenged in the beginning. Even the sound effects that you use, it's really polished. It's well done. So I'm going to ask the Building Men audience, when you get a chance, check out Spear and Clover podcast. So let's start there. Where did the name come from? Talk to me a little bit about why you decided to call your podcast Spear and Clover.
That's a great question. And this is an interesting interview. For Building Men, this is, I typically work with entrepreneurs and most of them are men. But for Building Men, I was kind of thinking a little more about, my life as a man rather than just my life as an entrepreneur. And so to give you a little background before I explain the Spear and Clover podcast, I was in the Army when I was younger, from 2004 to 2008, and picked up sort of this tribal brotherhood, this love for being on an elite team of people working hard. And one of the things we used to always do is ruck. We would put on a heavy backpack and we'd have to go walk. And so I'm 250 pounds. I hate to run, but I can ruck all day. Right. And so my dogs and I have 2 Australian Shepherds, and I live in the Indiana Dunes National Park, which is right out the window I'm facing right now. And we'll go at least once a week for, 5 to 15 miles. And one day I was out, ruck marching with my dogs. I had a 40-pound pack on my back and I had a 40-pound log on my shoulder that I couldn't put down, shift, but I couldn't put it down. Yeah. And we did 11 miles. And so as we're walking, I realize I'm like hoofing, I'm pushing as hard as I can towards my goal. And the dogs they're playful. They're running out into the woods and they're rolling around in the dirt. And then they're coming back in to check on me because they're good girls, and they're running back out and they're coming back to check on me. And it just occurred to me in that instant that, at my best, I'm able to do way more when I'm playful and experiencing life to its fullest, not just head down, feet moving, trying to achieve a given goal. And so in that moment, I came up with, if you're watching the video, I'm showing a tattoo on my forearm of the spear and clover, which is sort of a Spartan spear, and a kind of infinite loop of rope is the clover. And so to me, that's just a reminder to me that even any given goal, I'll be able to achieve it more when I'm kind of checking all the boxes in my life, if that makes sense.
I love that. And the thing that it drove me to is the book, The Alchemist.
Sure.
And coincidentally enough, my daughter got that as an Easter present, the actual book of The Alchemist. And there's a lesson in the beginning of it where the author talks about a story of an old man who was imparting wisdom on his son. He said, go out and learn the meaning of life, the meaning of the world. And the kid is out in the desert for 40 days, 40 nights. It's some story like that. Yeah. And he embarks upon this gigantic palace. And he goes inside, and there's a man who is the elder there who he asks, what is the meaning of life? And so the man gives the boy a spoon with oil on it. And he said, walk around my castle, come back with all the oil still in the spoon, and I will tell you what the meaning of life is. So the kid goes around, he comes back, the spoon is full. And then the man says, what did you think of the castle? What did you think of the tapestries on the wall, all these riches that I had? And the boy says, I have no idea. I didn't look at any of that shit, pretty much. I was focusing on the spoon. And he goes, take another walk around again and see everything. So he does, and he comes back, and there's nothing on the spoon. He said, I told you need to come back with the oil in the spoon. So the lesson was, like, you have to be focused on what your goal is. Focus on the goal, but in the focus on the goal, you also need to be able to take this broad look and have this perspective of all the great things that are going around in the same thing. And that's how I see the spear and clover. Like, you have this drive, this thing that's pushing you forward, but at the same time, being really cognizant of, like, hey, we're still all kids at heart. It's still okay to play and to enjoy the moment. So it really resonated with me, and the clover has this infinity symbol look to it as well. So it's really, really cool. I'd love to then, I'm intrigued with people that do podcasts as well. So your preparation for podcasts, was it something that you always thought about doing when you were younger? You mentioned your experience growing up. You went into the military for several years. Did you ever think, hey, I'm going to be in front of a camera? Did you ever think that this is something that I might want to do? Or is this totally brand new to you based on your experience running Zoom meetings?
So that's a really great question. So for starters, I'm an early adopter, kind of on everything, but I'm an early adopter on podcasts. I started podcasts every single day. I've listened to podcasts since like 2008, with very few exceptions. So very, very early, I got into podcasts and not only that, but I grew up, I would listen to talk radio all day and all night. I never listened to music almost at all. So I was listening to like Art Bell and Loveline. I'd like sneak it. My mom didn't want me to listen to the radio. She wanted to get a good night's sleep. And so I've always enjoyed sort of the art form of conversation. I've never gotten off of a phone call with an entrepreneur with less energy than when I got on. I always have enjoyed that. And so this is easy to me. But that being said, I still suck at podcasting. Guys, please come support me, please. But I'm brand new. I also believe in coaching. And so I bought a program called Grow the Show. I can't think of his last name, but it's Kevin C. He's terrific. He's actually coming on my show because he's a cool guy. But either way, I believe in investing in those skills that I want to learn, that I want to, especially if I want to do something professionally. So that's sort of the podcasting thing. But my whole life, I've always built businesses. I never noticed it until I was in my mid-30s, but I've always built businesses, or at least where I worked, around those things I was passionate about. When I was a kid, I loved snowboarding. I worked at the little snowboarding hill in town. I liked clothes and fashion. I worked at the mall. I liked cars. I worked at the car wash and got to drive all the fancy, expensive cars. Obviously the military service kind of derailed that. But I got out of the military, I was flipping bikes. I was flipping MacBooks because I wanted nice bikes and I wanted nice computers. And we got into CrossFit and rock climbing. And within like a year, we owned a rock climbing gym that had a CrossFit side to it. And so sort of my whole life, I've sort of leaned in on trying to make what I love the thing that I do all day, if that makes sense.
That's awesome. I had a conversation with, I don't remember if it was Kevin or the layer before where you do that.
I think his name's Logan
Yes,
or
it was. Yeah, great guy too. And the interesting thing,
he's
awesome.
I don't know if his name's Logan or not. And if it's not, bro, I'm sorry if you see this, but he was a killer. I told Kevin the first time I talked to him, I said, you could build a business around that guy. He was great.
The thing that I loved about him was his transparency, where me and my brother jumped on a Zoom with him and shared what was going on with our podcast, the growth that we had seen, especially in the last couple of months. And basically he said, listen, you don't need us right now. You're on the right course. You're on the right trajectory. Keep doing what you're doing, and then ping us back in 3 or 4 months if things are not going the same way that you thought. Where we were at the spot where I was ready to open up a checkbook, say, here's what I want, take my money, take my wallet and give me back what you think I deserve. And he was like, you don't need us right now. And I thought that was really cool. Not everyone does that in the business world. There's people that are looking to take advantage. So just a shout out to them. I think that's and it's something with a CH, right? Chemeldin or something along those lines.
I could pull it up and I don't want to butcher it, but kudos to you. Because when I got on the phone with him, he's like, you desperately need us. And so he hard closed me. And I did. And I'm really benefiting from it.
That is awesome. Well, you mentioned your experience in school and some of when you started doing businesses, snowboarding, it was the bikes and the computers. Take us back to your experience in school and tell us about a lesson or two that you learned in your experience in school that prepared you or that drove you to want to get into the entrepreneurial lifestyle.
Yeah, it's funny you asked that. So I've always had, what I think they used to call ADD, and I just call it entrepreneur's disease. So I've always had ADD pretty severely when I was a kid. They used to call me demon child, man. And I was setting fires and making tripwire traps in the backyard and pouncing out of closets on my dad's friends when they would come over. I was actually removed from public school when I was in second grade. And I was put into a year-round, no summer break, extended day school that was a bit for behavior disorder. And they could actually physically, there were smoke breaks for some of the students at this time. This was like 1989 or 90, I would guess. And in certain cases, they would be able to physically restrain students. Like this was a real deal school. And the thing was I was never a very angry person. I was never a very violent kid, but you could not teach a class with me in the room. Right. And so I found myself in this school from second grade till seventh grade. And what I found was, I don't know, at the time I didn't find this, but if they just let me do my thing and follow my interest, I would do so much. I was going through 3 math books a year. I was reading, I think I read every single existing Stephen King book in this time. And they would work with me individually, a lot like the way that I think some of the charter schools now and some of the newer styles of schools are, where I got to work on my own at my own pace. And because of that, I sort of farmed my interest. I would go towards the things that were interesting to me. And I've always liked learning, but it has to be something that I can connect to, if that makes sense. So for me, school was just so huge as a development tool for me, but it was very non-traditional, the way that I went through school. And so obviously there was, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, but there was sort of, there's a lot of, it was like waves crashing against the shore when I moved into regular school in seventh grade. And so that was definitely challenging through middle school and high school. So
when you went to that school, then it must have been interesting dynamic, one being in a school, if it was like a behavioral, a school for behavioral type issues with students. Did you have this identity that you were a quote unquote bad kid during that time?
I don't, it's hard for me to say. I'm a very introspective person now, but I can't honestly kind of say that I knew then that type of thing. What I can tell you is I was in school with violent people. I was in school with suicidal people, and I wasn't either of those things. I wasn't suffering from mental illness to the extent, outside of entrepreneur's disease, like I mentioned. Right. And I wasn't a violent person. I wasn't, sadistic or trying to cause fights or anything. What I actually developed, frankly, was sort of like an acerbic, self-defense through, sarcasm and speaking and my words. At the time, I was not yet 6'2" and 250 pounds. So right. I was like, I think I was like 8 or 9, and this was a K through 12 school. So there were people in there that were drug addicts and kind of violent folks. And, I had some really great teachers And through that experience, I can tell you, like, getting into a system like that it feels both hopeless, but also empowering, because I was able to learn so much by being able to be kind of at my own pace, if that makes sense.
Right. And the fact that you had teachers that cared about you, that saw the potential in you, it's so paramount at that time, because it's sink or swim at that point, right? When you're in school with kids that are having significant challenges, and my heart goes out to those kids, whatever happened in their life developmentally, that they were in that environment where there was, if there is drug use, if there is these behavioral things where they're getting into fights all the time, or suicidal ideations and significant anxiety. It's very challenging for kids who are not developmentally able to handle the enormity of those type of situations. So for you to be in that spot, you needed to be able to navigate pretty quickly these social dynamics, basically to keep your head. So
yeah, and
that contributed to your, once you're into an entrepreneurial lifestyle, it's not this like, cozy, hey, I'm going to get it paid every 2 weeks. You have to have this like sink or swim attitude as well.
Yeah. And I attribute so much of, not even success, but just what I do every day to my time in the military. One of the things that I really missed out, and I thought about this when I was thinking about coming on your show, is I remember, I wrestled at like 187 in 7th grade. I was like 11. I was a huge kid. And I was so sensitive because I didn't grow up in classes with peers. I grew up where I was the only one at that age. Maybe there was one other kid in the whole school that was my age, and everybody was either older or whatever. And so the thing that I do professionally now, which is sort of like this, I own a CrossFit gym in Chicago. I do jujitsu. Like my thing is like, I do strongman training. I love sort of that. Like if you think of like a loving drill sergeant, that's kind of like my persona in a fun and very loving and supportive way. But like none of that existed when I was in middle school and high school. So when all these kids, this locker room thing where it's like, if we love you, we're going to pick on you a little bit, or if there is this thing where we the playful ribbing, I would just like freak out and either want to fight or cry, because I didn't understand that relationship until I got to my military service. And so I remember like, being in football in high school, and like, I didn't know these kids when they were younger, and I didn't have experience, kind of like going through, like when you talk about getting picked last or any of that stuff, that was never a part of my sort of, 8 to 7th grade, whatever that 8 to 12 or whatever those years were. And so because of that, it wasn't until the Army, like all of the stuff that I am now was sort of put on top of what had come out of the previous, if that makes sense. Maybe this will be easier. I have 2 core values. I have 5, but 2 of my core values describe me. And one is spirit of the puppy, which is like super friendly, outgoing, very sensitive. I want to be around people. I've always had that. The other one that balances that out, I call military mindset. And I didn't get that until I went into the military. That's discipline. That's, toughness. That's sticking to things and taking ownership of the things that I'm responsible for. And so without those things, without that military service, I had all the intensity in the world, but I didn't know how to handle it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And the military mindset and the spirit of the puppy, also, it's a great analogy, or the tattoo, it makes perfect sense. Everything comes in together there. So when you go back into public education in 7th grade, and you spent the rest of your time in public education in a public school, what's a lesson that you wish you learned? Where did our public schools fail you in something, that 1 or 2 things that you said, wow, coming out, I never learned this, or I never learned that? What's 1 or 2 things that we can do better to help schools?
That's a great question, man. I mean, I think the obvious stuff that comes to mind that you probably hear often is, I don't think personal responsibility or personal finance were taught very well. I certainly think that traditional school is structured to put out sort of this median product of employees. Right. And so, there are going to be people at the top of that bell curve that are going to do great, and they're going to be doctors, and they're going to be entrepreneurs, and they're going to be movie stars or whatever. And then there's going to be people at the bottom of that curve that are going to do terribly, and they're going to be left behind. I happen to be friends with mostly those 2 groups. But then there's that median group, which it's sort of gearing you to punch a clock from 9 to 5 and to follow sort of predetermined paths. And so if anything, and I think this maybe has changed since we were both in school, but if anything, I would love to have been given this permission to make the reality that I wanted to see, to have a vision for something and make that reality. And the only reason, or not the only reason, maybe it's some of it is me, but one of the only reasons why I feel that I have been able to identify that was my mother was always so much of a champion for me.
During this time, and I appreciate you saying that, Jason, during this time growing up is when young men are developing their identity, their sense of self, how they see themselves fitting into their social groups, the family dynamics, to their community, and into the world. And a lot of that is based on what they see and learn from other men. So what was a lesson or two that you learned from a mentor, from a coach, from a book, whatever it was? What's a lesson or two that you learned about what it meant to be a man to you at that point?
For me, that was mostly the military. I actually, Sergeant Andrew Houghton, who recently passed away way too young, and when we went to his funeral, is the person I'm trying to be most of the time that I'm working, especially if it's as a fitness coach. Like, just this idea that, hey, I'm gonna be tough, but it's because I love you. Yeah, like, I love you. I want you to do better. And so, like, there is this. And it's the beauty. It's great when something can be effective. It's even better when it can be fun and funny and friendly, right? And so he taught me how to lean in to sort of this playful male culture that was supportive as we kind of go through sort of like doing hard stuff together as men, or as a tribe, which we were doing in the military, if that makes sense. So to me, I'm not sure. I guess I could have maybe come with something a little bit more prepared for that perspective. But for me, it was just realizing that the more truthful and earnest that I can be, the easier it is to develop relationships with other men, the easier it is to get into positions of leadership. And it's when I tried to shell up, like high school football, right? When I tried to not expose myself to the rest of the people around me, that's when I was alienated and felt not supported, and probably wasn't as supported as I should have been. Whereas if I would have just been like, hey guys, that hurts my feelings, can we just be friends? Like, maybe they would have been like, fuck yeah, let's be friends.
Right.
Building men of character, integrity, strength, compassion, and empathy through transformational mentoring, coaching, and motivational speaking is our mission here at Building Men. To work with me as a one-on-one life coach, you can find information in the show notes, or you can visit our website at buildingmen.io, where you can book a free 30-minute discovery call to help you become the strongest version of yourself mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. Now, back to the show.
Right. And to normalize saying, that really bothered me. That hurt my feelings, without fear of being called, a million different names by other young men. So you mentioned that experience in the mentor that you had in the military, the gentleman who had recently passed away. And as you're getting up to that point, then, before you went into the military as a high school junior, as a high school senior, what was it that pushed you in that direction? Did you feel like you needed the structure of the military? Did you feel like you had this overwhelming urge to serve your country? Talk to us a little bit about that decision.
Yeah, so I needed it because I was spirit of the puppy, but I wasn't military mindset yet. And so, in other words, here I was. I mentioned a few of these things, but the two that I didn't were pool and poker. I went real deep on pool and poker coming out of high school, and I had no focus or plan or discipline. And so I worked at a pool hall, I worked at the casino, and I would gamble all the time. I had a pretty good gambling problem. At the time I would tell you I was a professional gambler, but that just meant that I lived with my family at home and I didn't have a job. So any money that I did make or lose was from gambling. So I was in this situation, and it was one of those things, fortunately, that it was pretty obvious from the inside that this wasn't a sustainable thing. I wasn't going to be a professional for real. I wasn't successful at it, and I had no structure or anything. And I've always, again, from a very young age, my mother has instilled in me that I could do anything. And I just knew that if I didn't do something, I was going to do nothing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And what do you do in those scenarios? You join the military. And I got to tell you, it's impacted every day of my life ever since. And I can't more highly recommend something like that to add structure.
And you served in Iraq. Is that where you were?
Yep. I served in Iraq twice. And I was stationed in Germany for a good chunk of time, which was great. Got to see the world. I developed relationships that will always be there for the rest of my life. I don't think my identity is any one thing that I do, but it's certainly something that has informed sort of my understanding of what a virtuous man can be, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Virtue is such a great word. I'll include that in the title of this podcast. During your time in the military then, so you mentioned 2004 to 2008, around that time frame, there's a lot going on in the world during that time. It was, I'm sure, very, very challenging, not only physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally. We've had a couple military members on the podcast. One or two have talked to us a little bit about their experience. I'm curious to know, as far as the day-to-day, and it might have been very, very different depending on where you were stationed. But if you can give us a little bit of an idea around, on a typical day, what might that look, sound, and feel like?
Yeah. So, you nailed it. It was different depending on the year, right? Depending on where I was. And so at its easiest, there were many stretches of time where we weren't deployed or preparing to be deployed. And so they call it shamming. You'd sham, you'd figure out a thing to do, and your sergeant would be like, fine, go do it. I got to go clean my barracks. Okay, go ahead. And so you'd do almost nothing on those days. And it was a waste of time, but we did a lot of travel during that time. We would, take 4-day weekends. We were living in Germany. So we would go, skiing in the Alps. We would go see, Austria, or go to Amsterdam, or go to Paris, or whatever. That was very, very cool. And just, if you get a chance, do it. Like, that's great. But probably the more impactful thing was my second deployment to Iraq, which was 15 months. And I worked on essentially a chain gang. We were doing telecommunications, but we were digging holes, laying in conduit, which is like pipes, and pulling cable by hand. And so we were pulling miles and miles of like thick fiber optic cable to modernize the telecommunications of the base that we were on. And that was quite an experience. So there was 18 of us, and we were from every conceivable background. There were people that came from money. There were people that came from Alabama and were poor. There were different genders. There were different sexual preferences even. There were certainly different races. And one thing I will say, and this is why it's so easy to have perspective now with some of those topics kind of becoming hot button issues in the last few years, we couldn't quit. And there was no bus to get home. And so it was like, we figured it out. I have friends, James Jackson, Mike Stevenson, these guys that I haven't even seen in years that I know, I could show up and they would help me out, or they could show up and I would help them out. And I think a big part of that was like, failure wasn't an option. If a drill bit broke of one size and we didn't have another one, you're in Iraq. There is no Home Depot. You figure it out right now. And so there were days where, we're holding a 150-pound, jackhammer sideways in a manhole, trying to push a hole through this manhole, or we're up on a ladder. Or there were many times if the backhoe broke, we had one backhoe, the backhoe broke, we're using pickaxes and shovels, and we're still getting these 7 miles of cable through this hole today. And so, that was such an empowering thing. And the training I even got was as an engineer. It was as an electrical and telecom engineer. And because of that, learned how to troubleshoot. If this doesn't work, check down to the next step. If that doesn't work, check down to the next step. And so you combine those two things. And honestly, coming out of the military, the way I like to describe it is I walked into Chicago looking for eye contact on the street wherever I could find it, because I had absolutely nothing to hide. And I felt like I could solve any problem that was put in front of me. Does that make sense?
It does. And eye contact is so big. It's one of the things that in the original Building Men group, I would teach the young men. This is when you shake a man's hand, give him a good firm hand shake, and look him straight in the eye. And too frequently now, one, kids' heads are down looking at their phone, But even when they're not and they're interacting, there's a lot of chin down, not making eye contact. So when you're walking around making eye contact, it just, to anyone listening, when you're interacting with young people, have them put their shoulders back, put their chin out, like look people in the eyes. It just communicates this level of confidence, of that you are self-assured in what you're doing, even if you're not. You feel a little bit better when you do. So now I'm interested, Jason. I appreciate you telling us that story. When you're coming back, so when your time in service and your time of service is completed and you're coming back to the United States during that time, was it a transition period for you? Was that a challenge to come back and re-enter the norm? Or was it like, yeah, I got this. I just fucking did this all for 5 years. This is no big deal.
It's a great question. I can't exactly, I'm not going to claim to know how I felt. I'm sure there was some uncertainty, but I will tell you, this is BlackBerry time when they had it was like the Q9 or whatever, where it was like a little bit better than the old phones, but it wasn't an iPhone, right? I was typing resumes and sending resumes from my BlackBerry. I had no laptop, from my BlackBerry in Georgia, getting ready to leave. So when I landed in Chicago, I had a good job with a big company doing fiber optic work. I had an apartment already, and I already was kind of planning on what the next steps were. So I had spent the first 2 years of my, just to kind of not get in the weeds too much, but I spent the first 2 years of my Army life shamming and kind of getting over. And I spent the second 2 years getting my shit together, losing weight, getting in shape, and falling in love with hard work, especially on a team of other people, right? And so when I was getting out, and by the way, at this time, I'm reading like all the business books you can get. I'm buying Forbes. I'm trying to ascend, right? In my mind, it wasn't entrepreneurship yet, but it was definitely higher education. It was definitely, I wanted to do finance. I went to school for finance, banking, things like that. Go ahead.
Was there a program? Was there someone that you could speak to, a counselor type person that would help men and women that were leaving active duty to reacclimate? Was there someone that you could talk to, or a group or a program or anything like that?
Yeah, they do have like sort of the reintegration folks, and they do try to help you. The problem is, I think, and I'll get to the answer of actually who did help me, but they do have those structures in place. But one of the things is in those kind of bureaucratic, big organizations like that, you get into this mode where like every time you walk into a cinder block room, somebody's going to say some things and you're going to fill out some forms and then you're going to move on to the next room. And so I don't think I was really open in those settings to receive the coaching they were trying to give me. And maybe it was great, but I didn't get it. The people who actually helped me were the people in my unit that were old, meaning like 34, and, had an investment property here, or they had a second house there, or they had learned about how to invest in a portfolio of stocks. So like Sergeant Fowler, to shout out somebody, was telling us about how he had invested in some real estate and was able to do more. And to me, it always felt like I'm willing to do whatever I have to do to be able to live a life that I can enjoy and be proud of, and that will give me and my family a good life, especially if I enjoy it. Right. And so, at that time, I would definitely say I did not have a clear focus of what that meant, but I was all ears for a book or a magazine, wasn't into podcasts yet, or a mentor that was going to be able to like sort of like illuminate the path for me a little bit.
I appreciate that. Love it as well. And it's taking those little life lessons from spots you might not have anticipated them coming from, and being open and willing to hear the message when it's presented to you.
Yeah.
Take us from that point then. So now you're in Chicago, you have the job, you have the apartment. How do you go from there to getting into the CrossFit space and where you are now, coaching prospective entrepreneurs or men and women that are in business currently that need a little extra help?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I got back, I told you I had a job already. I got the world's easiest job ever. Shout out to Jack. Can't remember your last name, Jack. But I think he hired me just because I was a veteran, honestly. And it was a job for a company called Abbott Labs, which is a big pharmaceutical company outside of Chicago. And my job was to sit in a truck. That's it. Basically, I was the locator guy. So I would go around and I would spray paint the ground before they would dig or whatever along the side of the road. And 9 out of 10 hours of the day were nothing. I was listening to audiobooks, I was listening to podcasts, and I was napping and doing nothing. And it was kind of eating away at me, to be honest with you. And something happened very fortuitously. They changed the GI Bill. The old one was the Montgomery GI Bill, and the new one was the, I don't recall, something to do with Yellow Ribbon program, but it allowed us to go to a private school and receive a living stipend while we did. And so both myself and the other two vets that had moved to Chicago with me, we all enrolled in school. I went to school for finance at DePaul, and at the same time had just found CrossFit and rock climbing, had started to find some community there, was unwilling to pay the $200 a month for the CrossFit gym. So with my brain, we go get a space. We rented a space on the 4th floor of a dusty old building, and started a CrossFit gym before we had ever even belonged to a CrossFit gym. So I was faking it till I made it. And, for us, that spirit of the puppy for me and for my other friends kind of won out. And so we had, I could talk for hours about that experience, kind of building that from nothing. But we just wanted a place to train with friends and, climb rock. We had a big rock wall in there that we built. And those it would have never happened if we had been a little older or had some responsibility, but we were able to do it. And at the time it was a muse. It was something that I wanted to do, on the side while I was going through school. And then I was going to take over the world of industry through investment banking and da, 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 da. Well, I graduate from an honors course program in finance. I get this great starting job at the biggest bank in the world. I'm an analyst. And I just found that I was sitting in these boardrooms on these huge deals, and it'd be me and my boss and my boss's boss and my boss's boss's boss and the entrepreneur. And the only guy in the room that I ever saw eye to eye with was the entrepreneur. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And I remember that very vividly. I also remember looking around and seeing my boss's boss's boss and going like, that guy gets up earlier than me. He drives an hour in from a fancy house in the suburbs. He stays longer than me. And then he drives all the way home. I don't want his life. Like in the best case scenario, and I was not on the track for the best case scenario. I was mediocre in that business, right? In the best case scenario, maybe in 20 years, I can make $500,000 or whatever, but my life is terrible and I don't get to spend time with my family. And I just knew pretty innately that was not going to be a path for me.
I love that. And here's the thing, like being in a spot that I did leave that, not that I was anywhere near $500,000, but leaving the safety and security to roll the dice, to take the gamble. It's not easy. It's not pretty, but absolutely worth it. There's not a day that goes by that I think that was not the absolute most amazing decision I've ever made in my entire life was taking the gamble on myself. So if you're giving advice to someone right now who is on the verge of making that decision, what would you say to someone who's like, I like the safety and security. I have a pension. I get the benefits here. I get paid every 2 weeks. What's a piece of advice you might give to someone who's on the fence?
If you're that person and it's not killing your soul, keep doing it. But if it is, and it will be if it should, I always tell people you need to have an absolutely clear picture of the mountain that you want to climb. It doesn't mean that you know exactly the business or exactly the thing, but you want to, like, if you can tell me what you want your day to be like in 10 years, I can tell you the steps that will get you closer to that. If you can't, then any step we take is wrong. Does that make sense? And so for me, the more clearly you can describe the mountain that you want to climb, the much easier it is to then only take steps in that direction. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, don't think about it. Guys, if you're listening to this and you're a young man, great, you're in the right place, right? Life is longer than it feels. If something is hard and takes you 5 years to achieve, that's nothing. Because otherwise you might just waste that 5 years doing the wrong thing. And now you got to start 5 years from now, right? And so I really started to look at, not exactly at the beginning of my entrepreneurial career, but certainly now, I look at my decisions on a much longer timeline as like, if I make this move, if I shut that business, or if I start that business, or if I take this role, is this something that I think I might regret in 3 years? And if it's not, I fucking do it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And
yeah.
It's very inspirational. I'm sure a lot of the people that are signing up to work with you need to hear that in that way. It's that the playful, puppy dog, but also like, all right, I'm here, I'm supporting, I'm loving you, but let's fucking go. Like, get it on track right now. You got to.
Well, and on top of that, everybody said this before, but there is no such thing as mistakes. You're either winning or you're learning, right? Yes. And so because of that, I think there are maxims and platitudes that you and I we share on Instagram and we say on Facebook and we love, and all those things are true. You talk about Jocko Willink, extreme ownership, take extreme ownership. I remember saying that for years. And then I remember when I actually got it.
Right.
People will tell you, oh, there is no such thing as a bad night. You'll only have a great story. And I remember thinking that for years. And then I actually got it to the point where when something goes wrong with me now in traffic, I start to laugh. I skip the anger and go straight to the laugh. And it's because I actually know, I got something to talk about later. This crazy woman in line at the store today did this crazy thing. Rather than getting angry, having to kind of digest it and then come back later and tell the funny story to my wife, I just jump right to, ooh, good. Now I have a good story. Right. And it's the same thing with business. It's like, you want to start a business? I don't think, maybe once now, but for a long time, I never said no. I would say, yes, but yes, but then it needs to be this, or yes, but my time is limited, or yes, but this, because I know that no matter what we do, if we do it together, if we do succeed, it's going to be great. And if we fail, we'll have a story. And so fuck it, man, let's go grab a shovel, but it's one thing to say it and it's one thing to hear it. And it's one thing to know it. It's a whole nother thing to when your employee comes up and they shit the bed, to be mad at yourself, not them. That's extreme ownership. And you have to get to a point. I've gotten it down to like one person in the world who I can't do this with, and that's my wife. But other than that, when something happens, typically I'm able to own it and my response to it for the most part. Not always. It's constant, right? I'm still struggling to figure out. I'm a young married couple. We're 3 years in. We've got a 10-month-old daughter, Lucy, in the other room. But for the most part, I actually believe that ownership thing now. So when something fails in my business, I go, I didn't train them well enough. Or even if it's their fault, I didn't recognize that they weren't a good fit. Right.
So it's good advice for people who are on the fence, whether or not they want to go into this lifestyle. What about people that are already in it? What do you see as the biggest stumbling block or struggle that new entrepreneurs are experiencing? And what advice do you give in that situation?
Boy, we could talk about that all day. Yeah. But the number one is everybody wants to be Sisyphus. Everybody wants to roll the stone up the hill every day. And so the good example, and the one that I'm sure a lot of folks you've met do, is, let's say you want to be a fitness professional. And that's who I've typically worked with, though I do work with others. If you think that you're going to open a gym and the only thing you got to do is be the best fulfiller of fitness to be successful, you're out of your mind. I could introduce you to 500 people that respectfully are not doing well, and they're the best coach you ever met. You could send any single person in, they'd be the best coach they ever had. What they need to focus on is building a business, right? The analogy would be, if you wanted to be a mechanic and all you did was become a really good at changing oil, great. Now one person can change oil X number of times per day. It doesn't get you anywhere. What really gets you somewhere is building a team who can then change that oil, and understanding exactly how many ads you need to put out, how much dollars you need to put out in order to acquire a new client, knowing how much effort or money or whatever input results in new money walking in the door. So if I was going to give somebody advice, I would say, don't focus on the thing that you're good at, focus on the thing that you're not good at. Right. And so for some folks, if you're a fitness entrepreneur, you better focus on the entrepreneur part. If you're an entrepreneur who buys a widget company, well, then you better focus on the widgets. Focus on the thing that you're the least good at all times.
Great advice. Yeah, and I know you do a whole podcast around it, so it's a loaded question in that capacity. I like to end the podcast with asking the question: if the Building Men audience is listening to this right now and they press stop on the episode, what's one thing that they can do right now that by doing this one thing can change the trajectory of what's going on in their life?
Well, I already mentioned understanding the mountain. So I'll do a different one. I might have said understanding the mountain you want to climb and only take steps towards that. But since I already covered that, the other one would be, I take this very seriously. You are a combination of the 5 people you spend the most time with. However, where I divert is I believe some of those slots, let's say you're in a place where, you don't have friends that are out there taking over the world. That's okay. you can replace those slots with books, with podcasts, with mentorship, with programs like ones that you run. And I think for me, at least one of those slots is podcasts. The podcasts I listen to are all sort of, I'm constantly being exposed to virtue. I'm spending my days rolling jujitsu with people where it's the truth. Right. And so I'm surrounding myself with people that deal in the truth, that have common ethics, that are seeking virtue. And so because of that, it's not only something that I desire, but it's something that's expected of me to show up for those folks with virtue and with an ethical take.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bonus question. If I'm a 17, 18-year-old and I'm thinking about going down this entrepreneurial path, what's the first book you would recommend them reading?
I like Built to Sell is the one that people don't recommend that I do love. Built to Sell is a really good explanation, especially if it's anything to do with service businesses. It's a very easy read. It's sort of a novelized approach to sort of what a person who had a quote unquote successful business, but had structured it poorly. And in the service business, value is all about how you structure things. So it's a quick read. I think it's like a 3-hour audiobook. And it's all in a novelized format. I would definitely read Built to Sell. And I would, if I was a 17-year-old kid and I thought I wanted to be an entrepreneur, I would volunteer at the closest person who did it really well. And I would do everything that they told you to do. And if you can still hack it and you don't think about how much money you're making or not making, you'll be fine.
Absolutely. So much value in that apprenticeship and that role of a mentor and what they can do in your life. Jason, where can the Building Men audience find you?
At Spear and Clover on Instagram. I'm at Jason Skeesick on Instagram. Same with Facebook, kind of across all platforms. It's at Spear and Clover. And we have a great YouTube channel. We have a podcast that's growing. Would love to have some of your audience come check us out.
Absolutely. We'll put all that information in the show notes for the Building Men audience, building.men on Instagram. Buildingmen.io is our website. Check out our sponsors, FTR Apparel for all things Building Men, and Become Stronger Industries, the makers of handmade steel maces, hammers, and other badass equipment. To the military mindset, spirit of the puppy, Jason Skeesick. Truly appreciate it, my man. Building Men audience, go one step further than you thought you can go. We'll see you next time on Building Men.